Hi, my name is Fran Boait, and I am the Executive Director of Positive Money. We are a non-profit that researches and campaigns to reform the money and banking system to enable a fair, democratic, and sustainable economy. And I'm going to be talking to you for the next half an hour on positive money and climate change. So clearly, if we want a sustainable economy, we need to tackle climate change and avoid ecological collapse. And I'm going to talk about why money and banking is a key part of that. It's currently a barrier to getting to our goals on a sustainable economy, but it can also be part of the solution if we reform. So I'm going to talk about a number of ways in which the financial sector, both public institutions and private ones, are fueling the climate crisis and ecological breakdown, both in direct ways and in a number of ways which are more structural. And I will talk about some of the ways that we can change these kind of negative repercussions and actually redirect to ensure that we do tackle the climate crisis. So first, in terms of direct ways, since the Paris Agreement, we've seen the 35 biggest banks funneling over $2.7 trillion into fossil fuels. Now, British banks are the worst in Europe, and what we've seen is Barclays lending over $118 billion between 2016 and 2019. And in that same time period, we've seen HSBC lending more than $86 billion into fossil fuels. So maybe that's not surprising, but it shows there's a lot of work to do. Now, looking at our public institutions, Positive Money focuses on central banks as our most powerful economic institutions are often not working in the public interest, even though that might be their stated mission. And when it comes to climate change, that's no difference. They are generally reinforcing rather than stemming financial flows into fossil fuel activities. So we work both in the UK on the Bank of England and in the Eurozone on the European Central Bank. But today I'll be focusing on the Bank of England, which is where Positive Money UK, which I'm the director of, is focused. So the Bank of England, as part of its quantitative easing programme, which is where it creates money to buy assets, mostly government bonds, but also some corporate bonds, in order to essentially keep liquidity in the market, has a lot of negative side effects, which I won't go into. And it's, in terms of its corporate bond purchase scheme, it's still it's purchasing corporate bonds issued by fossil fuel companies such as BP and Total, resulting in a balance sheet in line, the Bank of England's own balance sheet is in line with 3.5 degrees of warming. So this is more than double the government's own Paris Agreement commitments. Furthermore, via a new policy which has been set up in response to COVID, which is called the COVID Corporate Financing Facility, the bank has been lending billions of pounds directly to carbon-intensive companies, including airlines, car manufacturers, and oil and gas companies. And we calculate that as of 24th of June 2020, a few weeks ago, 56%, which is over £10 billion of these loans, were held in high carbon sectors. So despite the rhetoric of a lot of politicians, but also the Bank of England itself, that we need a green recovery, we can see that there's not really much seriousness behind that in terms of the way that they've gone forward with simply bailing out the biggest corporates without any environmental and social conditions attached. So, Positive Money isn't saying don't ensure companies don't go bust, don't rescue them, but we should have learnt the lessons from the crash 10 years ago when we bailed out big banks without any conditions attached and the resulting problems that caused. So now, there's generally a consensus that we need a green recovery, but we can see that policies aren't matching the rhetoric, both in the Bank of England and also the government. So how do we address these? Well, as I said, we're working in Positive Money UK on greening the Bank of England, and the Positive Money Europe works on the ECB. But there's some specifics we can do. Now, as I mentioned, the corporate bond purchase scheme, which is part of the QE scheme, needs to be greened essentially. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be excluding carbon intensive fossil fuel assets from those purchases. Now, Andrew Bailey, who is the governor of the Bank of England, when he arrived earlier this year, there was a hearing with the Treasury Select Committee. Now, ahead of that hearing, we coordinated a letter with many high-profile signatories, individuals, organisations, academics, and we were saying that we can't not consider climate change in things like the corporate bond purchase scheme. And he agreed when questioned by an MP, which is the group of MPs of the Treasury Select Committee that scrutinised the Bank of England, the Treasury and other economic institutions. When they questioned him on this, the open letter we'd sent, he said that yes, because of the public interest, he would certainly make this a priority. However, we've seen in the response to COVID and the economic fallout, the Bank of England go back on its word and essentially prop up carbon intensive firms, oil and gas companies with absolutely no conditions attached. And that's really disappointing. But we have hope that they will change their ways, hopefully coming soon. Another way that we can get the Bank of England to green the financial system is through credit guidance. So we can think about how we steer bank lending towards green activities and away from dirty activities and fossil fuel lending. As I said earlier, the bank lending is huge to fossil fuels still. So what we need to do fundamentally is make the cost of lending to fossil fuels too much. If we look at the risks associated with climate change in terms of financial stability, then they are really high. And Finance Watch has done some calculations which shows that we should actually be having a risk weighting of 1,250%, which would take into account the real risk of continuing to fund fossil fuels. Now, just a quick word on risk. As I said, this is really important for, I haven't said this yet, but it's really been really important for getting the regulatory system, specifically the prudential regulation, to take climate change seriously, because we can see easily that climate change is a huge risk to financial stability. So therefore the regulatory framework as it stands needs to take into account of this. Both thinking about things like transition risks, the cost of carbon assets becoming very volatile, but also in terms of physical risk, when we think about the weather events, flooding, etc., that will become more and more frequent. So this has been a really important way in, and we need to take that further to really calculate in and have these penalising factors on fossil fuel lending. Another kind of low-hanging fruit way, if you like, that the Bank of England needs to green itself is by revising the CCFF, the COVID corporate financing facility I was talking about before. There's absolutely no excuse for not attaching social and environmental conditions to this CCFF. It's critical. And if we're serious about green recovery, and we're serious about the rhetoric, not just of the government, but also of the Bank of England, we're seeing it in other nations and internationally, then they have to put their money where their mouth is, if you like, and actually do the policies that add up to the rhetoric, that add up to a green recovery. It's not happening at the moment. We also think that they could reinvest proceeds from the CCFF into, say, a state investment bank with a green mandate. we not only need the private sector to be aligned, but we need public institutions like a state investment bank, like smaller community banks, regional banks, to have a green mandate. Otherwise, we're not going to get into financing the things we need for a green recovery. We also need to think about a green mandate for the Bank of England. So, as I've mentioned, this is a critical lever of the Bank of England, and the best way to ensure that action on climate change is going to be taken is if you go to edit the mandate, which is the highest kind of charter, if you like, that the Bank of England works from, and it's set by the Treasury, which is run by the Chancellor, which is a democratically elected person. So the Treasury should be adding that we need an environmentally sustainable and stable financial system as an objective for the Bank of England in its mandate. We also think there needs to be shared objectives in the context of a 10-year green recovery programme that should be implemented. Following on from this, we've certainly talked a lot about positive money, how it's critical that we get our central banks and our finance ministries or treasuries to work together. If you have fiscal and monetary policy moving in opposite directions, which you actually had in the UK at least quite a lot after the crash, where you had essentially the government undertaking austerity at the same time that the Bank of England was doing loose monetary policy. It just didn't work, and all you ended up doing was making the rich richer and everyone else's living standards fell and wages stagnated. You have to have the Bank of England and the Treasury working together. And we've suggested that one way this could be implemented, is regular reporting of the climate risks from the Bank of England to Parliament through official channels. We also want to see the Bank of England working more with the Treasury and with the Department of Business, Energy, Innovation and Skills. If we're going to have a green recovery, we're going to need jobs created in these sectors. And obviously that can be applied to different departments in different countries. And finally, we need the Bank of England to act more directly as a fiscal agent to government. There's no reason why it can't help with targeting borrowing costs to ensure that those seeking to borrow to, for example, build a solar farm have targeted low long-term interest rates. The Bank of England should also be thinking about using its money creation powers to support the economy and the financial system in terms of aligning it with climate change. We've seen in the COVID fallout that the Bank of England is doing money creation through QE, but it's, at least this time, the Treasury is spending money. So there's indirect monetary financing happening there. The money is still going through financial markets, which isn't ideal, but at least it is indirectly getting into government spending. The Bank of England has also said it could do direct monetary financing, which is also something that we've been calling for a long time. So as you can see, there's a lot of direct changes that could happen right now, and they might seem small, but actually this is where the leverage points happen to really rewire the system to ensure we do start prioritizing a green recovery and stop with the status quo of funneling billions of pounds into fossil fuels. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about another project that we work on, which is called Climate Safe Lending. And that is a innovation network. It is stakeholders from across the banking and climate system. So everyone from a person in a big bank that works on climate policy to positive money, who work as an outside perspective, trying to put pressure in different ways, through advocacy, through grassroots organising, on public institutions like the central bank to change things. So through this, we kind of get ourselves into a space where we can try and understand each other better, and work towards aligning bank lending, both in Europe and North America, with Paris. So it's a transatlantic project. And there are 5 areas that we look at working with the banks on, which I'll just run through. So first of all, there's taking responsibility for climate risk. And I've talked a bit about how crucial risk has been for getting the climate finance debate into the regulatory framework. There's still work to be done, but also the risk conversation is limited because of the inherent uncertainty. It's actually been called radical uncertainty, even by the Bank of International Settlements, in terms of quantifying the risk, because there are so many tipping points in the system of climate that actually, if we kind of try and go down a route where we calculate exactly the risk changes second to second, day to day, month to month, year to year in terms of climate. It doesn't really work. It's a good starting point, but it's not good in the long run. So we need to think about climate impact, which says, looking at a bank's balance sheet, what is literally the climate impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of that? There's a group of banks already looking at that. There's something called the Platform for Carbon Accounting Financials, which you can look at some of the banks looking at that. Then there's the really hard one, stopping the flow to fossil fuels. Now, when we look at climate finance, banks much prefer to focus on green than to think about stopping funding fossil fuels. And that's absolutely critical if we have any hope of tackling climate change. Then there's decarbonising our economies and balance sheets. So this is, pretty complicated and difficult, but it's absolutely crucial, not just for private banks, but also thinking about public sector institutions and planning, whether that's from a very local level right up to national and international. And then finally, there is the green finance. So how do we finance innovation for a sustainable future? This isn't straightforward, and there has been a significant amount of kind of greenwashing in the green bonds market, where, finance has been saying, oh, we're so good at funding green projects. But when you look into them, they're not really transformational. And actually, what we really need, if we're going to finance the innovation we need for a sustainable future, is different kinds of financial models. So small banks, community banks, different lending institutions that can be a lot less, a lot more kind of innovative, I guess, and dynamic in the way that they look at financing projects and understanding projects, ensuring that we, as much as possible, look at, if you like, patient capital, so low interest rates over long periods of time, in order to make sure we get sustainable financing of projects. So again, these are all quite direct ways that can be changed, and these are areas which have the most conversation around them. But I just want to spend the last 10 minutes or so, maybe a bit less, on the kind of structural problems that we also think about positive money. So I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that if we have economic growth continually, we are absolutely going to exhaust all of our resources and keep emitting carbon dioxide to an unsustainable level. And yet we find ourselves with governments around the world looking at gross domestic product as GDP as the measure of economic progress. And even those who kind of critique it have said, they've often said you can just complement it with other measures of progress, so inclusive growth or green growth, rather than the more difficult conversation of how we move beyond GDP. So we released a report in May which looks at, contrary to the mainstream narrative, we show that GDP growth regardless of the form it appears to take, does not, like whether that's inclusive or green, it does not enhance life satisfaction, it does not alleviate poverty, and fundamentally it will always undermine progress on the environment. So there are major issues with the idea, I'm sure you've also potentially heard about, around decoupling. So this idea that you can have increased GDP growth, but it can be decoupled from carbon dioxide emissions or other resource consumption. That just isn't the case, and it is pretty impossible. It's been proved again and again to be flawed. So these kind of better kinds of growth don't fully recognise the failures of economic growth, and so don't really allow us to face up to the fundamental changes that we need to make. However, it's not that simple to get rid of GDP growth, and the paper we launched called The Tragedy of Growth looks at, how in the absence of growth in capitalist economies tend towards unemployment and deepening inequality. And that's potentially what we're going to face now. We've had to shut down our economies, which has been critical for public health, but obviously that comes a collapse in productivity, if you like, in growth, to up to kind of -15%, -20%, big amounts of contraction of the economy. And there has a tendency towards unemployment and deepening inequality. And so there are these growth imperatives within the system, the structure of the system, which present a kind of barrier to reaching a society that can move away from GDP and what we would like to see prioritise human well-being and environmental sustainability. We obviously focus in on the money and banking and financial system in the paper, and we look at the growth imperatives between financialization and growth in high-income countries. So if you look at actually the last 10 years or longer, we've had a highly financialized economy, but actually quite low growth. And if you look in the UK, kind of more post-World War to the 70s, we had a low financialized economy, but high growth. And actually what we need, what we kind of argue that we need, is financially stable. So one that isn't so financialized, doesn't have such a big financial sector relative to the rest of the economy. So a low financialization, but also low growth or even non-growing economy, a stable one. And to get there, we look at the role of interest-bearing debt as a growth imperative, and the fact that we need to put forward quite transformative policies to escape the growth paradigm. A key way is to think about how we equalise the relationship between the creditors and the debtors, because that's really locking us in at the moment into this growth imperative. So some ideas that we put forward include a universal basic income issued via a central bank digital currency, also a direct clearing facility, the importance of public banks and modern debt jubilees. And, these are all ideas which are gaining traction anyway and can be very transformative, not just in kind of direct ways, but in indirect ways, in shifting the structure underneath in terms of the monetary system. So we kind of see a need for all of these on our post-growth money and finance system. And we also look a little bit in terms of the alternatives. So we need to think about dashboards for well-being, if you like, rather than just a one measure, which also has problems, whatever the measure. So alternative indicators can be thought of as education, carbon emissions, life expectancy, and we need, to be serious about the high uncertainty, high stakes situation that we live in, and we're clearly in a world which is facing an intersection of crises, and so we do need to evolve and step up, if you like, our decision making. So we go into quite a lot of detail on the benefits and pros and cons, but we look at places like New Zealand, who have a dashboard of indicators. They also happen to be one of the countries that did best in the pandemic, and they focus on well-being as a in their treasury department, in their finance department. And so whilst in the UK we do have this ONS, which is our Office for National Statistics, they do publish figures. It's just not really taken any notice of. And if we're serious about it, then it needs to be we need to ratchet down the kind of media circus around GDP figures and ratchet up the conversation on well-being. So I think I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll end there. But I'd really welcome you to take a look at some of the things I've talked about. So our tragedy of growth paper, our climate safe lending project, both Positive Money UK and Positive Money Europe's website. And please do sign up to get our newsletter. Maybe I'll just leave with a bit of polling we did when we released the tragedy of growth paper. So we commissioned a polling company which asked over 2,000 people on whether they wanted the government to continue prioritising GDP or prioritise health and well-being in the crisis. And 80% of people, 8 out of 10, said they wanted the government to prioritise health and well-being. And we asked them whether after the COVID crisis, the government should prioritise GDP growth or social and environmental indicators. And again, 6 out of 10, 60% said they wanted the government to prioritise social and environmental indicators. Now that is a step forward and shows that the public are ahead of the government on this topic, as they often are. But I think we're starting to see people really valuing what matters to them, which is really crucial for the amount of change that we need to happen in the next 10 years. So unfortunately, I can't be with you on the 28th of July, but my colleague David Barnes, who's an economist at Positive Money, and I think some of you will know him, will be with you, and he was the main author of the Tragedy of Growth report. Thanks very much for listening, and hope to have more contact with you at some point in the future. All the best.